Hi everyone, and welcome to Module 2.1 in our class. This module, we're going to pivot away from a lot of the frameworks and philosophies around user experience and dig deeper into user interface, understanding design principles that come into play when designing interfaces, as well as some of the pain points that a user might experience. This module, like our first one, will span 2 weeks. And in the first week, we'll cover web-based or desktop-based, browser-based applications. And the second week, we'll focus on mobile applications. So what we'll cover in today's lecture is a review of Module 1. We'll talk about web design principles, pain points, as I had mentioned, and different UI or user interface design systems that are provided for us by major companies, which is pretty fascinating. But first, let's review what we did in Module 1. We talked about a definition for user experience, that being end-to-end an experience a user has with a brand. You also learned about different frameworks to approach a design problem, as well as how to identify and frame a problem statement. Frameworks such as design thinking, human-centered design, or user-centered design, as well as a double diamond model for problem solving. You learned about identifying personas and thinking about who is using and who are the end users for your product. We also briefly talked about advocating always for the needs of our users, but also balancing that with the needs of an organization. You also learned about usability principles. For example, a product has to be easy to learn, has to be memorable, and that there are, in that honeycomb diagram, a number of factors often overlapping that go into how usable a product is. That honeycomb diagram will come in handy for our assessment for this week, as well as next week, where you're looking at the pain points for different products. So first, let's talk about websites and web apps. These are the two things that we really browse for in a web browser on the web. So what I mean by a web browser is something like Google Chrome, Safari, Opera is another kind of used web browser. You might be familiar with Microsoft's Internet Explorer. That browser has not been used as much, but you'll often sometimes see people still using Internet Explorer. Those are all, or Mozilla Firefox, or Firefox is another example of a web browser. And I think DuckDuckGo has also gotten to the web browsing game. DuckDuckGo is a browser that ensures like privacy of its users, so it doesn't sell your information to third parties and things like that, or your browsing history, and kind of sees itself as a competitor to Google Chrome's private browsing option. So those are examples of web browsers. You can obviously browse the web on a laptop, desktop, mobile device, but for our purposes, we're looking solely at websites on a sort of larger screen browser for this module. Some examples of a website are, and essentially if you were to break down what content is on a website in its earliest iteration is hyperlinked text, and there wasn't even images or videos, but just text and hyperlinked things such as this link here on the slide, local coffee shop. Today in the modern web, we understand websites to be links, images, videos, some kind of maybe animation or something like that to make the site a little bit more interesting. But blogs, coffee shop, restaurants, those are all that just display information. Those are all websites. Web apps or web applications are programs or software that run in a browser, not on your desktop. So you have to be connected to the web for you to access them. And they allow for some kind of interaction with the user. An example of a web app is Gmail. right? You can send an email, you can compose an email, you can check your email. As emails come through, it's updated dynamically. And so if I were to send you an email, you would receive it almost within a few moments if you have a good connection. If you're not connected to the web, you're not able to access Gmail, or you can access it through an offline setting, but it's not content that's being updated dynamically. Adobe Spark, if you've taken content creation or if you've encountered that software, it runs all through your browser, allows you to create content and graphic deliverables, video editing a little bit, making a website all in your browser. Banking website is another example. Hopefully you're kind of getting the idea about the difference between a web application or a web app, as well as opposed to a website. We'll kind of pivot and talk about why these things are easy to use. One of the principles for usability is navigability, how easy it is to learn, and for it to be memorable. One of the ways that designers and developers think about, one of the things that they think about when creating a website or a web app, are design principles. And some of these principles, a lot of the principles, are actually from art principles. So if you've taken any kind of art class, like a 2D design class, for example, a lot of these will be familiar. And the idea is that throughout the web, we use these principles in order to make it easier on an end user to use the product. We want to lessen the cognitive load of navigating the web and navigating these sites in order for you to get a certain task accomplished. In the early days of the web, if you were around, I was, there were these websites that individual users could build. And it was kind of like the wild, wild west of the web. GeoCities is an example of a website where anybody, any kind of person who had any kind of interest could create a web page, code it themselves, design it themselves. And there were no real standards at the time. And so you could have like a very niche topic, like, I don't know, ping pong heroes of the 1920s. And you could create that site with whatever content you wanted, and it could have flashing text and different background colors and things like that, because there were no real web standards at the time. This was maybe like late 90s, early 2000s. Today, we know that we can apply art and design principles to make things a little bit more navigable and legible. So we'll talk a little bit about that, and we'll also discuss the elements that are often used in web design. Some of them are invisible, such as a underlying grid structure. Some of them are visible, like headers, navigation bars, breadcrumbs, images, and then this concept of responsive web design. So first, let's talk about grid systems. These are carried over from print design. If you were to look at a newspaper, you would notice that everything is neatly organized into columns. And what's fascinating about newspapers is that it can get away with really narrow column space because a user, or a reader rather, is always going to be able to track what they're reading because of that narrow column. If the columns were wider, you'd actually lose a reader because the eye can only follow along a line so much before it remembers its place. So often you might have experienced this, or perhaps you have an early reader in your house. They use their fingers to track where they are when they're reading on the line. And then they go down to the second line, and they might use their finger as a guide. It's very easy for our eyes to get lost. If you have narrow columns, it's a lot easier to read. And so grid systems are a way for us as an underlying structure that most everything on the web has, and we don't even notice it anymore. A great example of this is any newspaper website, but I have the New York Times queued up here. And you'll see how it literally took the format of the newspaper and kind of translated that for the web. So we have this super nice 3-column grid, still kind of looks like a newspaper, and then more columns here divided. So within this, there are 6 columns rather, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I would assume that because this has 3 large columns, it also has an underlying 9-column grid underneath, right? But it just makes it so that everything is easy to read. And you'll notice here, everything is aligned, this paragraph, that image, that caption, right? It creates like a really nice flow and flexible too. So previously you were at like a column number divisible by 3, and then you have this 4 column now, but it doesn't look out of place. It all looks very well balanced, and grids are a great way to organize information, tons of information, in a way that makes it easy for us as users to scroll down and our eyes move around naturally, and are still able to understand and focus on the content. So this is what I mean by some of these principles are invisible, because you don't see the actual lines of the grid. The content just fills in that underlying grid structure for us. I have a few other examples, so we don't have to go through those. So the next principle is repetition. When you repeat elements on the web, you get a really cohesive experience. And what can that look like? So here's a IBM website. You can repeat various elements on a page to make things look cohesive, but one of the most common ones is repeating color or branding colors, for example. IBM has its own brand guidelines, and for the web, usually organizations or sites will have consistent colors for how they present information. So for this, we can see that buttons are this blue color, right? So anything that's interactive has that kind of brighter electric blue color. There's this notice up here, which is actually becoming very common for websites, to show that upper banner as a sort of, this is the most, this is like the latest notice or post or alert. It's very, very common. You can see grid structure, but also what can be considered repeating elements, the way that it treats the text here. So all of the first line is bolded, and it has copy text and then a link here. That makes all of this content easy to digest. And I can see right away that, oh, these are articles. I can click on them. Here's a little brief summary if I didn't want to actually click on it, but I can scan it. The other thing that's fascinating about the web is most people don't actually read the web. We scan in an F pattern. So first thing our eyes do when we land on a page, and the reason why so many pages are built in a certain way, is we go down on the left-hand side, and then we go across, and then we go down and then across again, like a letter F. And that's mostly in the Western world, actually, where we read from the left to the right. Other cultures where text is written in different sequence, there's a different eye tracking pattern, but in the Western world, we generally read down from left to right, and then left to right again. And that's why we see often in navigation, the most important things being here on the upper left-hand corner, and then they sort of go in hierarchy, which are another term we'll learn about in terms of hierarchy, are spread across here. So repeating elements, you could also see the grid underlying structure here on the IBM website. And just like in the usability terms, a lot of these principles overlap or are used in conjunction with one another. They're not used individually or within a vacuum. You actually have to use them all together to get a really successful site. Let's take a look at the Ben & Jerry's site. So Ben & Jerry's also uses their brand colors to move your eye. So as a user, when you land on this page, the first thing you'll probably look at is that large image. And then following that tracking pattern, we go from the logo down to sign me up and then across. It's using colors here at the top, the same color, repeating that color in order to draw attention to this call to action, which will close. Color is being repeated, similar to that previous site. It has icons, bolded text, and link. So this is a very common thing to do when presenting information. And repeating this like isolated image style. So it's not showing you products in different styles, which can sometimes be jarring for a user because they don't actually know, they can't tell like, what is a product being photographed? So this really focuses on what the product is. This right here is called a card in web design. So it has like image and then that basic card shape and then usually linked information. And so that is another good example of how elements, they're not the same in terms of, we're not using the same exact icons, but the style of them is similar enough that a user can really quickly scan them and say like, oh, these are things that are important to them, to the organization. And so that's repetition. Hierarchy, which I just mentioned, refers to the most important information being the largest usually, or there's some indication whether through scale, what size, color, or another indicator to focus the eye. Vimeo, which was a main competitor to YouTube up until a few years ago when they changed their business model to be like, basically you can now create and edit using the Vimeo platform. This is their website, and this is what you see above the fold. Above the fold is a term that we have taken from newspapers. Typically newspapers, when you see them out in the wild, they're folded in half on like a newspaper display. So the most important information was typically above the fold. So any kind of important news, breaking news for that day was printed up top. Any sort of less important news was below the fold. That's where the origins of that term in web design come from. So similarly, you put the most important information or the biggest information that you want a viewer to see above the fold. So for Vimeo, we can clearly tell that it's this tagline or text that they want us to understand: unlock the power of video, simple tools for any professional team and organization to create, manage, and share high quality videos. So that is their slogan, and they want you to join for free or see plans. And see plans is highlighted in a color, right? Implying first that you're going to read this large text. Second, you're going to want to see plans. Less emphasized here, interestingly enough, in white are join for free, right? So they don't want you to just sign up for free. They actually want you to pay. So that's an example of hierarchy. This one uses scale as well as the weight of the text to do that. This also looks like Apple does something very similar where it's like a white background against really large text and then a sample of their product. They do a really good job with marketing their products in a very like just show the high quality of the product. Responsive design is I can change the size of my browser, making it skinnier. Oops. And you see that it actually adapts to the size of my browser. This is super important because what happened as more people started to browse the web with their phones, you didn't have to create two different entities or websites. You could just create one site, use responsive web design to make it easier to navigate. Most people we know will visit a site on their laptop and they continue viewing it on another device. So you could seamlessly switch from one device to another. We'll talk more about responsive design when we get to mobile next week. I wanted to bring that up this week as something for you to think about in terms of usability. Last thing that we'll cover today is thinking about how designers and developers use all these principles of design to create things that we think are useful for a user. So we want to make it as friction-free as possible. We want to make it really easy in terms of when I scan it, can I understand the content? When I am in a hurry, am I able to easily get what I need? If I make a mistake, will there be some kind of feedback loop that corrects the problem and that allows me to still complete the task that I want? Pain points in UX refer to barriers that cause a task to not be completed. These are frustrating interactions with digital products, and they can be caused by a number of factors. It can be your network connectivity. You might lose Wi-Fi and you just are not able to complete a task. Let's say you're buying concert tickets and your Wi-Fi goes out. That's really frustrating if you're in the middle of the process of purchasing and for whatever reason your task isn't completed. And then you have to start over, right? So often pain points are unintentional, and these can be caused by bad design, poor implementation, technology, or factors that are beyond your control. An example that I found on the web as it relates to both something in the design and development of a product that can be really frustrating is in form design. So we've all probably filled out forms on the web. This one was an example that somebody posted, and she was trying to get like healthcare access or signing up for a healthcare plan. And she had a 2-letter last name, but in the form itself, it did not accept 2-letter strings of text, right? So the program itself was designed, and they probably thought that as an error mechanism, if you just accidentally typed in 2 letters, then that wouldn't be a problem, or that somebody would be able to catch that, and then you wouldn't be able to sign up. But what if that person actually does have a 2-letter last name? Then they're not able to sign up, and there was no other way for this person to sign up because there was this error. So design can sometimes, this was probably created as, again, a mechanism to catch mistakes, but also to catch spam. So if there's just like a spam bot crawling sites and, just spamming this form, there's probably a way to catch that also, and unintentional, or to capture if there was like bad data, for example, somebody, or, I don't know, your cat moves across your keyboard and sends something, for them to be able to catch that. But that doesn't really work, right, in practice. So that's an example of a pain point. You probably notice these things throughout your day as you're navigating technology that are built into certain products. And that's one of your assignments, is to start identifying pain points through a diary study. So think about that throughout the semester and throughout your day in the digital space, but also in the physical environment. What are pain points because of designed products for you that you encounter? It's a really interesting exercise, and I hope that after this, a lot of students will tell me they start to notice, like, oh, this is not a product that is built for me. It's built for X person. That is, example of a pain point. Because the more that we're aware of them, the more that we can report things to, developers, product designers, and say, like, this is not working for me. And that only improves a product in the long run. Oh, sorry. So I kind of lied. The actual last thing that we'll talk about are design guidelines. The web is vast. And how do you design consistently for a vast web? There are standards. There's something called the W3C. I think by their definition, they are a super PAC of nerds, and they write all of the standards for the web. There's sort of the governing body for what goes into the web. It's a really interesting site if you're interested in standardization. You can go to w3.org rather, and it's here it says W3C is an international community that develops open standards to ensure long-term growth of the web. So it has everything from like accessibility, internationalization, privacy, web security. There are tons of different work groups, and they, publish information on different industries. So it's really interesting how they just talk about things and the standards that they develop. The web is no longer the wild, wild west of yesterday. So they have really moved the web forward in terms of how we access information, what information looks like, and what content looks like. The other guidelines and systems, the US government has standards for how information is relayed on government-owned sites. So Section 508 is a accessibility guideline, essentially, that says all content on websites that has some kind of like government affiliation has to be accessible. So that's a standard that is implemented by law. You might have also heard of WCAG, WCAG, and that is a guideline for presenting information in different ways on the web. So actually really interesting lawsuits happening in the past couple of years around WCAG and universities, for example, not providing content in accessible manners. What I really wanted to talk about here was these design guidelines. So the reason why the web looks the way it does is because there are standards, and often different organizations will provide guidelines. So the example I wanted to show you is the US Web Design System. And this is a really fascinating group within government that creates standards for all federal systems. In government, I don't think every single federal entity has updated to the system yet, but this group maintains, and they're federal employees, they maintain and basically provide all the different principles, components for anybody working in government to be able to update their sites. And it's actually really interesting to read through. I highly encourage you to read through their design principles. And it's a lot of the stuff that we're talking about in our class. Start with real users, earn trust, embrace accessibility, continuity, listen. A lot of those are human-centered design principles. And then they actually provide templates. So let's see. We're just talking about forms. Oh, let's look at their address form template. So they give you how address form on any federal site should look. right? That way, regardless of what entity you're working under, you have a reference for what that looks like. Landing pages, if we go to any official government website, they say this is the template that it should look like. They should not look differently. And for good reason, right? Government services should look a certain way to have legitimacy. So I've always found that to be a really useful resource. I often refer to their work. Let's see, the two other ones I queued up. IBM has an open source design system too. It's very similar to the US Digital Web Design System. We can look, and they talk about why they do certain things. We talked about grids earlier. Let's have a little video showing their grid system. Different components, they'll actually provide you with this. So if you're a developer for any sort of IBM integrated system, they'll give you the components so that there's consistency throughout. So we're not making up standards. And then the other one I queued up is Apple has human interface guidelines, right? So you see the kind of Don Norman influence here, putting the users at the center, and they provide things for apps, for all their technology, really, and how you design those interfaces. And this is really interesting because, let's see, they'll give you a lot of, so how to configure it. So if you're designing, this is for software. If you're designing software, it's always going to look and feel like an Apple product. So that's how we keep the web consistent, is by creating guidelines, following them, standardizing them across the entire platform. And that is a huge part of what organizations want, because they don't want users to have to parse out, what am I looking at here? They want people to understand right away what this is, what the product is. And one of the ways to do that is through the user interface, so that you can get to the heart of what you're actually looking for. All right, so that was this week's lecture. I hope you found that useful. I'll see you all next week for module 2.2, where we talk about user interface design for mobile apps. Have a good week.